The rain had not stopped in 3 days when the first Sherman came out of the tree line. A German gunner saw it the way you see a thing you have killed 100 times before. A medium tank, American, nothing he had not burned already. He had been told exactly what these machines were and what the men inside them were made of. He was wrong about the second part. He would not live long enough to learn how wrong. Somewhere in the mud of eastern France, in November of 1944, an army was about to collide with a truth it had spent 12 years refusing to believe. And the men carrying that truth were sitting inside those tanks. Men their enemy had been taught could not, by nature, be sitting there at all. To understand why that gunner was wrong, you have to understand what he had been taught to believe. For 12 years, the men in those panzers had been raised inside a single idea, that some people were born to rule and some were born beneath notice. Nazi doctrine had a rank for everyone, and near the bottom of it, below almost everything, it placed the black man, subhuman, incapable, fit for labor and nothing more. This was not a whisper at the edges of the German army. It was printed in its school books and stamped into its policy. This was a regime that had gone looking for German children with black fathers, the children it called the Rhineland bastards, and had them sterilized so the bloodline could not continue. That is how seriously they took it. It was not rhetoric to them, it was policy, carried out on their own citizens. And on the battlefield, there were recorded cases of black American soldiers being executed after they surrendered, killed for the crime of having fought at all. The German command believed it so completely that they tried to make a weapon out of it. They printed leaflets and scattered them over the American lines, aimed at black soldiers. "Why die for a country that treats you like this?" they said. "You are cannon fodder for white America. Cross over, surrender. This is not your war." Berlin was certain that the racism inside the American army was a seam they could pry open from the outside, certain that a black soldier of all people would have no reason to keep fighting. It was a reasonable bet, on paper. These men had every reason to lay down their arms. They were being asked to die for a country that told them, in its own written law, that they were not equal to the men beside them. The Germans had done the math, and the math said these men would break first. So when a German crew met an American tank in the autumn of 1944, they carried an assumption in with them as surely as they carried shells. They assumed they knew who would be inside, and they assumed those men would rather run than die. They were about to be corrected on both counts, one burning panzer at a time. The unit was the 761st Tank Battalion, the first black armored unit the United States ever sent into combat. They had names, and the names matter because for a long time afterward, almost no one bothered to learn them. Sergeant Harvey Woodward, a tank commander. Private L.C. Byrd, out of Tuscaloosa, standing behind a .50 caliber gun. Claude Mann, a driver from Chicago. Ordinary men from ordinary American towns who had volunteered to fight for a country that had made very clear it did not consider them equal. They had trained for 2 years, first at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, then at Camp Hood in Texas, while other units shipped out ahead of them, because the Army could not decide whether it trusted black men with tanks at all. The doubt did not come from the enemy first, it came from their own side. They trained in a segregated army, in southern towns that made them ride at the back of the bus and enter through the side door, and then handed them tanks and asked them to go die for the country doing it. They had been told, in 100 quiet ways, that they would break under fire, that they did not have it in them. So they took a motto for the battalion, 3 words, and they meant them as an answer to every doubt that had ever been aimed at them. Come out fighting. In September of 1944, they finally shipped to Europe. They came ashore at Omaha Beach in October, weeks after D-Day, and rolled inland toward a war that a lot of people on their own side still did not believe they could fight. And the first man with real power to say out loud that they could, the first to stake his own reputation on it, was the most feared general in the United States Army. On the 28th of October 1944, General George Patton stood in front of them in France. He did not give them a gentle speech. Patton did not have a gentle speech in him. "Men," he told them, "you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." It was not tenderness. It was something these men had been denied their whole lives, and it landed harder than tenderness would have. It was expectation. Patton was telling them he expected them to fight like anyone else, no excuses offered, and none allowed. For men who had spent their whole lives being told that less was expected of them, being handed the full weight of a soldier's job was its own kind of respect, and there was a hard edge under it. Patton had asked for more armor, and the Army had given him the 761st, partly because it did not know what else to do with them. He was not a man with modern ideas about race. Read his own diaries and you will not find a hero of civil rights. But Patton wanted to win, and in that moment, winning meant these men, in these tanks, going where he pointed. So he pointed them east, into the Lorraine, toward the German guns. Whatever was in his heart, he had just given them the one thing 2 years of training had not: a job at the front, and the expectation that they would do it. And the men in those panzers, waiting in the rain, had no idea what was coming toward them. Before the guns start, there is something you should know, because it is the part that usually gets left on the cutting room floor. You will not find most of these men in the war movies. You will not find them in the textbook chapter on the Battle of the Bulge. For 30 years, the Army filed them under a footnote, and a lot of families were left holding a name and a folded flag and no story to go with it. So here is what I am asking. If someone in your family served in armor, in a tank destroyer, in the motor pool that kept them running, and especially if he served in a unit history tried to forget, put his name down in the comments. Not for me, so that it is written somewhere that he was here. Now, the Lorraine. On the 7th of November 1944, the 761st went into its first real fight, near a cluster of French villages with names most Americans have never heard. Morville-le-Vicq, Moyenvic. Cold, wet, open ground, exactly the kind of place armor dies in, and they did not break. That was the first thing the Germans got wrong. The crews that Berlin had counted on to crack, the men the leaflets had been written for, drove straight into dug-in German positions and kept coming. They took anti-tank fire, they lost tanks and men, and they held the ground and pushed the line forward day after day in weather that turned the fields to grease. In that first month alone, the battalion took roughly 150 casualties and kept fighting. They fought through Morville and pushed on toward the German border, tank by tank, in a campaign Patton was driving as hard as he drove anything. When a Sherman bogged down in the mud, the crew climbed out under fire and worked it free. When a commander was hit, another man took his place in the turret and kept the guns firing. This was not a unit looking for an excuse to fall back. This was a unit that had waited 2 years to be here and did not intend to give the ground back. Somewhere on the other side of that line, the assumption was quietly coming apart. The enemy that was supposed to fold was instead grinding them backward, town by frozen town. Picture the after-action reports going up the German chain of command. American armor, aggressive, well-handled, refusing to break. Nowhere in those reports would there have been a line explaining the one detail that would have unsettled Berlin most. To a crew raised on the doctrine, the way these tanks were being fought would not have made sense. The men doing it were, by everything the Germans had been taught, not supposed to be capable of any of it. But holding a line has a price. And one man in Company A was about to pay all of it at a railroad crossing outside a town called Guebling. His name was Ruben Rivers, a staff sergeant, a tank commander from Oklahoma. On the 16th of November, near Guebling, his tank hit a mine at a railroad crossing. The blast tore his leg open to the bone. By every rule of the Army and every instinct of self-preservation, Ruben Rivers was done. The medics wanted to give him morphine and get him out. He refused both. He refused the morphine because he wanted to stay clear-headed. He refused the evacuation because his men were still in the fight. He took command of another tank and kept leading, on a leg that should have put him on a stretcher, for 3 more days. On the morning of the 19th of November, German fire was tearing into his company. Rivers could have pulled back. His officer ordered him to pull back. Instead, he radioed that he had spotted the enemy guns, and he turned his tank toward them to draw their fire off the rest of the company. He was still firing when a German round struck his turret and killed him. His commanding officer put him in for the Medal of Honor. It would be a long time coming. For now, hold on to the fact of what he did, because it is the answer to the leaflet. Berlin had dropped paper over the American lines, telling men like Rivers that this was not their war, that they owed this country nothing. And Ruben Rivers answered by bleeding to death in a tank rather than leave his men. The doctrine did not have a category for that. It still doesn't. In December, the Germans threw everything they had left into one last gamble in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. And the 761st was sent into the worst of the winter to help stop it. Near a Belgian town called Tilley, in the first days of January 1945, they ran into a German SS Panzer division and fought it for 5 straight days. They attacked with a handful of tanks against dug-in armor, in snow that hid the mines and froze the wounded where they fell. Tank after tank was lost in that fight, and they cut the German supply lines they had been sent to cut, and they held. This is the part the movies skip. These men were not fighting one battle and going home. They were in the line, in combat, for 183 days, almost 6 months without relief. In that time, the 761st fought across 6 countries and was loaned out to 3 different field armies and more than half a dozen divisions, handed off, again and again, to whoever needed armor thrown at whatever the Germans were holding hardest. They were never anyone's own for long. They were the unit you borrowed when the job was ugly. By the end, the battalion had a casualty rate near 50%. Half. Half of them, killed or wounded, over 6 months of a war their enemy had insisted they had no business fighting. They lost dozens of tanks, and they liberated more than 30 towns on the way into Germany. Each one a place where people who had been told the Americans were coming looked up and saw who, exactly, had come to free them. Here is what I want you to sit with for the rest of this, because it is the whole point. Every mile the 761st pushed forward was a mile that made a lie out of the thing the German army believed most certainly about the world. Berlin had built a war around the idea that some men were born to win and some were born to serve. And the men they had placed at the very bottom of that ladder were right now, in the snow, taking their fortresses apart. In March of 1945, the 761st hit the Siegfried Line, Germany's last great wall of concrete and steel on its own border. The official record of what they did there is not a legend. It is a citation, signed by the United States Army. In breaking through that line, the battalion accounted for more than 4,000 enemy casualties. They took 31 pillboxes. They knocked out 61 anti-tank guns. Over the whole campaign, the unit destroyed or captured hundreds of vehicles, 34 tanks, more than 100 heavy guns. 31 concrete pillboxes taken by the men Berlin had printed leaflets to talk into surrendering. The machine that was not supposed to exist was now driving into Germany itself, and there was nothing in the doctrine and very little on the ground that could stop it. Try for a moment to stand inside the losing side of this. You were raised to believe you were the top of the natural order. You were handed the best tanks the world had ever built and told the men across the field were beneath you. Not brave, not skilled, barely men. And now those same men are burning your Panthers, taking your pillboxes, and walking into your homeland. Nazi doctrine held that this could not happen. To a crew raised on that doctrine, watching it happen anyway, there was no way to explain it. That did not end with the doctrine itself being a lie. That is the reveal the title has been holding back. The Germans feared this tank unit. They feared the American armor that kept coming through the Lorraine and the Ardennes and the Siegfried Line and would not stop. What they never knew, what would have broken something in them to know, was that the men inside were the exact men their entire worldview said should never have been there at all. The soldiers Berlin had ranked beneath everyone were the ones taking their country apart. Had the German command understood that in real time, it would not have made them fight harder. It would have told them the thing they could least afford to hear, that the idea they had built a war on was simply, provably false. The war in Europe was almost over when the 761st reached its last and strangest mission. In early May of 1945, alongside the 71st Infantry Division, they came to a place in Austria called Gunskirchen. It was a concentration camp, part of the Mauthausen system. Inside were thousands of Hungarian Jews, starving, many near death. The people the same racial doctrine had placed even lower than the men now opening the gates. Stop and hold the shape of this. Men who had been called subhuman by their enemy and treated as second class by their own country were the ones who walked in and freed the ultimate victims of the idea that some people are worth less than others. They knew, better than almost anyone in that army, exactly what that idea cost, because a milder version of it had followed them their whole lives. And they were the ones who ended it, at that gate, on that day. There is no cleaner answer to Nazi doctrine than that. The people it ranked at the bottom of the world were the ones who came to shut its camps. A few days later, in the town of Steyr, Austria, the 761st met the soldiers of the Soviet army coming from the other direction. The two fronts touched. For the men of the battalion, the war in Europe was over. They had started it as a unit nobody wanted to send, and they ended it standing on enemy ground with the fighting done. And then their own country took its time admitting what these men had done. For those 183 days, the 761st had earned a presidential unit citation. The Army did not grant it until 1978, more than 30 years later, when many of the men were old and some were already gone. Ruben Rivers waited longer still. His Medal of Honor did not come until 1997, 52 years after he died in his tank at Guebling, and it was handed to his family, because there was no one else left to hand it to. I am not going to dress that up, but I do not want the delay to be the last thing you carry out of this. I want it to be the men. Because whatever their own country was slow to admit, the Germans had understood it in real time, at the wrong end of a gun. That American armor could come from anywhere. That courage never once checked the color of the hand on the trigger. The 761st proved it across 6 countries and 183 days. And it took the United States another generation to say out loud what the enemy had already learned the hard way. These men waited decades for their own country to say their names. You should not have to wait to say the ones you carry. If someone in your family served in a war for a country that had not yet decided to treat him as an equal, a man whose unit got written out of the history, whose recognition came late or never came at all, put him in the comments below. His name, where he served, the year if you know it, and tell me the one thing about his war he almost never spoke of. I would rather this row of comments hold their record than let the paperwork be the only thing that ever did. They came out fighting for a country that had not yet earned them. Put their names down here, so that this time it is written.